Hi there, welcome. This is Visitations Conversation. The Visitations Conversations, excuse me. The purpose of this program is to provide inspiration to people aspiring to go deeper into the world of comics and entertainment. Please check out the channel for interviews that range from comic creators, podcasters, cosplayers, and filmmakers. My name is Scott Larson, and I am the creator of the independent comic book series Visitations. Visitations is the history of Chicago as seen through the eyes of the residents of the city's oldest cemetery. It's part adventure, part history, and part horror, all rolled into one, kind of like The Untouchables meets Indiana Jones in a graveyard. If you're interested in reading a free digital copy of the first issue, please email me at visitationscomicbook, all one word, at gmail.com or click the link below. My guest today is somebody who I've spoken to a number of times since I've started this, and Danny Fingeroth is a writer and editor. He worked in comics for many years, and over the course of the past few years, he's been doing biographies of people. He did a biography of Stan Lee, and he has a brand new book out now, which is a book about Jack Ruby, the many faces of Lee Harvey Oswald's killer. So, or assassin rather. So, Danny, if you'd like to come on, we're all set for you.
Hey, here I am.
There you
Yeah,
are.
the actual title is Jack Ruby: The Many Faces of Oswald's Assassin. But thank you for inviting me back, Scott. Nice
Oh,
to.
of course. Anytime. So, you've been well, I guess the first question I have for you before I start any other questions is why? Why? Um,
You
it's
know that.
Oh, real quick for anybody who doesn't know, this book deals with a lot of different historical things and a lot of conspiracy theories of which we don't have any in today's world. And so it's kind of fun to go back and look in the past and see, this world is that's just completely different from ours. But why did you decide to do this, Danny?
Well, let me give a spoiler alert. By the way, I do not solve the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination. That many people, much smarter than I, who've spent the past 60 years researching nothing but, have got their own solutions to that. But that does tie into the why, because it's about 10 or 12 years ago when it was coming up to the 50th anniversary. I was 10 years old when the assassination of Kennedy, and then 2 days later, the assassination of Oswald by Jack Ruby happened. And obviously, it was a shattering event for me and my generation and the country and the world. Um, but I don't think I took any more of an interest in it than a lot of people. I knew there was the Warren Commission report. I knew that a lot of people thought that that was flawed, either intentionally or on purpose. Um, it was just too big. It made uh, reality far too uh, porous and malleable and hard to handle. So I mean, I sort of took it in stride, or just like, okay, this happened, these people were involved, maybe this other stuff happened, but nobody's really sure, and it's just too friggin' big for me to like it get wrap my arms around. And so I'm gonna go watch the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and about 10 or 12 years ago, I was kind of wanting to kind of stretch my boundaries creatively and professionally. And I thought, gee, I wonder if there's some kind of graphic novel that could be done with the Kennedy assassinations coming up on the 50th anniversary. And I did some research, and it didn't seem that anybody had announced a graphic novel. It turned out that Dan Mishkin and Ernie Colon were doing one, but that had not been announced. So there was nothing. And I went, well, okay, so seems like, a lot of books coming out, but nothing graphic novel wise. So I started researching the Kennedy assassination in a way that I had not really ever done. And it became quickly apparent to me that Jack Ruby's story, that for me, someone who's descended from Eastern European Jewish immigrants to America, and who's obsessed with Jewish American history and pop culture and mainstream culture and history and politics. Well, Jack Ruby, this crazy Jewish guy who changed history by killing Oswald on TV, that was my entry point. That was the thing that I was going to kind of look at the story from that point of view. Um, and I got a guy named Howard Zimmerman, who some of your listeners may know, or your viewers may know, as the editor of Starlog and a longtime editor for Byron Price, which is where I met him. Was working as a packager. I guess he still is. And he put me together with Rick Geary. And we put together a proposal, an 180-page graphic novel about Jack Ruby's life. And then along the way, I realized that Jack's rabbi was very important in his life, a guy named Hillel Silverman, who's the father of the actor Jonathan Silverman of Weekend at Bernie's.
Mhm.
And I knew so, and then okay, I was able to get in touch with that guy. I interviewed him. He gave me access to his notes from visiting Jack every other day in prison for like 4 months. Anyway, that was going to be a graphic novel. Rick did 10 great pages. I wrote a 180-page script, and then for a number of reasons, mainly that we couldn't find a publisher. A lot of publishers loved it. Oh, I'd love to publish that. Okay, you got to pay us enough money so Rick can spend 2 years drawing it. Maybe not. So people loved it. I mean, it was a classic thing. Well, I'd buy that. That said the publisher, the editor, and I go, well, don't you think other people? Anyway, didn't happen. Still available as a graphic novel if anybody wants to pick up on that. But put it on the back burner. Both Rick and I did, and then about 2 or 3 years ago, now that I'd written, several books, including the Stan Lee biography, A Marvelous Life, I said to my agent, well, now that I have credentials as a biographer, the book got, pretty well reviewed and sold well. So I said, well, maybe I wonder if I could do the Jack Ruby thing as a straight prose graphic novel. And then he was able to sell it to Chicago Review Press. And then I had to do a lot more research and obviously a lot more of a certain kind of writing, it was no longer a comic script. It was I no longer had sort of that luxury of the visual, where a picture can tell, as they say, 1,000 words, and when the reader could maybe interpret and interpolate um, their own feelings and opinions into a picture. And then I now how to write a book and address some of the hard questions I didn't even really know existed. And along the way, I mean, I guess maybe sort of this is probably a longer question answer than you wanted, but
Oh, it's
along the way, I did become obsessed with the Kennedy assassination and with Jack Ruby, so it's sort of, as opposed to an obsession grew into a book, it's a book that grew into an obsession.
That's interesting. Um, all right, I have several questions, and and the first question I'm going to ask you is about you stretching your creativity. And I'm certainly interested in talking about the content of the book. But, one of the things that I've noticed, and the thing that's funny about it is when you take a look at someone like Stan Lee, who wanted to go off and write the great American novel, and he never did, at least not to my knowledge. We've got Danny Fingeroth, who started in my life as editing Amazing Spider-Man, and then you were writing Web of Spider-Man, and then you were doing all of this stuff, and then you wrote Superman on the Couch and a couple of how-to books, and now you've got two biographies under your belt. Is there a third that I know of?
Technically, I wrote about 15, 20 years ago. I wrote some YA novels of a couple of different movie stars whose name,
Uh-huh.
I mean, but those were literally, you know, those were books I researched purely online. And I mean,
Uh-huh.
those were work for hire, books to capitalize, that I forget the publishing company. They just, did it because these people, it's embarrassing. I can't remember. It was people, two young people who were big stars like 15, 20 years ago. And
Mhm.
I'm not purposely blanking. Anyway, so I guess technically I have written two other
Yeah.
biographies. I, 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 I'm not suggesting any, unless, you're really a Danny Fingeroth completist, I'm by no means suggesting people need to pick those up and add them to their
Is
collection.
it is your name on them?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, okay. So they can be found. They're not just done anonymously by
Oh
somebody.
no, 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 no. They were work for hire, but definitely under
Mhm.
my name. Big, yeah, famous people. I'm just like, I guess I blocked out those. Anyway,
So
yeah,
So what has it because you interview people at conventions and you give talks at conventions as well.
right.
So you're doing all of this stuff which goes far beyond, editing Spider-Man, which is where I found you, and that's why I'm referring back to that. And editing other things and even writing comics. How have you found that journey? Because one and sorry, I before you answer. I know that there are comic book writers who have written novels. Greg Rucka has written a number of different novels, and other people have as well. But this kind of goes far beyond the norm. And it's like I said, you've done things that Stan Lee has not done. And it's true. So what was that journey like for you?
Well, I mean, I guess you came in sort of while the journey was already in progress, because, I am somebody who, as a teenager, would go into bookstores to see where my books would fit on the shelves in between um, I was somebody who knew at a very young age that my books would go between Faulkner and Fitzgerald, um, you know,
Huh?
alphabetically. So somehow I had this, you know, I identified, as a creative person from a very young age. Like a lot of comic people, there are very few people who start out to want to be comic book writers. It's a very, what I mean, what draws one of the things that draws a child to comics is the visuals. And so, I as a kid, I just drew endless comic book type pages, superheroes, drew a lot of baseball players. Um, I was a big baseball fan, specifically a New York Yankees fan. Sorry, Chicago folks. Um, so then I had I was on the editorial board of my high school literary magazine, or if say in elementary school, if they needed a drawing for a project, I'd be the guy they'd call on. Not that, I mean, my skills were okay for a 8 or 10 or 12-year old, so that was always my identity. I was a decent student. Um, but I mean, sort of a crossroads in my life. I mean, this is the really long form answer. When I was a sophomore in high school, um, my English teacher, who was, really smart, inspiring, interesting guy named Richard Sadokow, at the Bronx High School of Science in New York, he said, "Well, next year for your junior year, you can just take regular English." Or there are also going to be a couple of specialized classes. One is creative writing and one is journalism. And, if you want to do either one, you need to apply and send in samples. So that was sort of a crossroads because sort of some of what I do these days is journalistic in a way. But I said, I want to be in creative writing. And I think I literally went to the study hall and spent an hour writing something and handed it in. And I got into the creative writing class. So that might have been one of the most, active decisions towards a creative goal. Um, and from that time on, and then in college, I ended up it was sort of I became interested in film, and so I became a film major in college. And then shortly after graduating, I got the job, an entry level job as an assistant editor at Marvel, working for Stan Lee's brother Larry Lieber in what's called the British department, which
Mhm.
was mostly reprint material for England, but also some new material. That's why my Wikipedia page is constantly wrong. And no matter how many times people try to correct it, it says I started working at Atlas Seaboard, which I did not. Larry had worked at the company with that name, so because he was my first boss, anyway, that's a real digression. So you came into the Danny Fingeroth story, it was already well along, um, and then there were those 18 years at Marvel Comics as a writer and editor. Um, and sort of then I've just been on, without trying to sound too highfalutin, this journey of discovery. Um, you know, it's it it's a combination of practicality and whatever skills I may possess and a certain amount of luck. I mean, um, I went to a high school reunion, and a guy who I'd gone to high school with was an editor at a academic publishing house. And he said to me, "You have any ideas for books about comics?" And that's where, I pitched him a bunch of things, and that's where Superman on the Couch happened. So for both Superman on the Couch and Disguised as Clark Kent and The Rough Guide to Graphic Novels, which are three of my previous books, a lot of research was involved. And so things that approached journalism or historiography so that was, and then I packaged and edited and produced a magazine called Right Now Magazine for Tomorrows, which lasted for about 7 years, about 20 issues, and a couple of trade paperbacks that came out of it. And there again, I did a lot of interviewing, and so I sort of almost gave myself an education in journalism and interview techniques, and then ended up doing a ton of stuff in my capacities at the Museum of Comic and Cartoon Art, not just their festival, but for the museum itself. So somehow I did end up doing tons and tons of interviewing, coming up with ideas for panels and events, and then shepherding them through, and doing a lot of interviews where I'm the subject of an interview like this. Um, and then I spent 4 years traveling, as a vaudevillian with the Wizard World
Mhm.
uh, comic convention chain, where they hired me specifically to put together um, offbeat, interesting panels, and then to come up with the panels and run them and find people for them. So I had this sort of a, so the and so then, okay, so after the nonfiction books, um, the biography of Stan Lee was something that had been on, again, something on the back burner for years, something I tried to interest him in doing as an authorized one, where he told me, if I wanted anyone to do it, it'd be you, but I don't want anyone to do it. Was I the 10th person he said it to that week? I have no idea. But eventually, you know, I was able to make a deal with the St. Martin's Press and Macmillan, or my agent was able to make a deal with St. Martin's Press Macmillan. Um, and so that was sort of the next step. And it's not a memoir per se, although I'm in the book a lot because I knew Stan and worked with him, although I was by no means in his inner circle, but I knew him. And so, I'm like everybody in comics, I have this fantasy that I'm going to write the ultimate insider comics industry
Uh-huh.
memoir, and maybe I will. But you know, writing about Stan Lee's life means, because he was born in 1922 and died in 2018, it's also a history of a first generation American born children of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. It's somebody who was in the comic book business very near the beginning, who was also related to Martin Goodman, the founder of, Timely, Atlas, Marvel. So it's a history of comics. It's a history of Jews in America and New York. It's part my history in the comic book business. It's my bringing to the table this understanding of how comics works, that even the most gifted, talented biographer or researcher could not. So while I'm not saying I accomplished what Stan did, I sat in some of the same types of chairs and situations. That so that book really was sort of a natural extension of a lot of my interests. And then the Jack Ruby thing, since it did start as a graphic novel in a way, is tied in, but it definitely was a challenge to myself. Could I write a book that is not based in the comic book industry or about superheroes or about any of those personalities? I mean, it's funny there, you know, because of who I am and my interests, namely like comics and Bob Dylan are some of my great interests. There's a lot of references to both comics and Bob Dylan in the book. But and the other, a thing that's happened, not surprisingly, um, is that is that whenever people will often think I'm talking about Jack Kirby when I say Jack Ruby. They just hear it because of who I am, and so um, I even did one talk a few months ago for a group of students from college students in Pennsylvania, where the talk was called Stanley and Jack Ruby because they
Mhm.
wanted me to talk about both those. And Stanley, rather Jack Ruby, Jack Kirby did a 3-page comic about Jack Ruby for Esquire magazine shortly after Ruby died in 1967. So there is, there are some interest. You can even if you're not looking, but especially if you're looking, you can always find similarities. So that was an interesting challenge for me to see if I could stretch to do something that's not about the world of comics. And yet there are, Ruby's background definitely reminded me of both my own family and of the comics creators. I mean, Jack Ruby was from the same generation as Siegel and Schuster and Bob Kane and Bill Finger, and I mean, and his family happened to end up in Chicago, not New York. Um, but they're, in an odd way, you know, there were those parallels that so made it somewhat familiar territory for me.
Um, so you've now done two biographies, and this one is more of a historic. I mean, the other one's historical as well, but you know what I mean.
Right.
Did you study any other biographers before attempting this? Did you like look at Doris Kearns Goodwin or David McCullough or anybody like that?
I read a lot of biographies, just in general. And, one when I after I'd written the Stan biography, I now belong to a couple of different biographers organizations, and I go to attend a lot of conferences, both in person and online, and I meet regularly with a group of other biographers. Um, but so I didn't, and over the years, like I said, especially when I was first researching it for the graphic novel version. I mean, I have, many, I own, dozens, if not hundreds of books about various aspects and people of the Kennedy assassination. Then there's a bunch I just read from the library or borrowed from people or read online somehow. So, um, and then endless websites and I did read. So I was, I was, look, you can't write this story of Jack Ruby without delving into politics and political history. But
Mhm.
I figured since I realized early on that I was not going to find that one clue that everybody else had missed about the real
Mhm.
truth, um, then my role was to try to paint a portrait. My role and my skill set and my background, because don't forget, even when you're writing, right? I mean, I wrote a book called Superman on the Couch. Part of it had to do with all that time, those 2 decades I spent in comics alone, not talking about other writing, but just 2 decades in comics, just thinking about what character, what makes this character tick, what makes that character tick, how would they react in this situation, what's their psychology, what's their background. So all that stuff comes in handy with nonfiction, to say the least. Um, so the thing, I mean, but so I read a lot of biographies, and I found, a couple of things I discovered along the way is some people are great storytellers, and everything they write comes to life, and no matter who it's about or how obscure, and you want to turn the pages and learn more about the person they're writing about. And I learned sort of the opposite lesson because so those are the really kind of the great biographies to read and be inspired by, and I include autobiographies and memoirs. And then what you come across quite a bit is people who had really interesting lives, but their biographies are snooze fests. You go, how did this person
Mhm.
take this really interesting life and make me want to go to sleep? So I tried to be inspired by the well-written ones and to kind of learn a lesson from the ones that kind of leached all the color out of a life story. And look, let's face it, my background in comics, all my training was how to make every page a cliffhanger and how to make the end of every chapter, make someone want to go to the next chapter. And it's sort of that. So I tried to do that with both the Stan Lee and the Jack Ruby books without adding any artificial melodrama, but I was very conscious of not getting so overwhelmed, not overwhelming my reader with so much research. Because with both those books, and this, look, um, as we know, someday somebody's going to write a book, and I'm only half joking. Somebody's going to write a
Mhm.
book that's called Stan Lee, worse than Hitler or only as bad as Hitler? I mean, right? So, right? I mean, clearly the passions around Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and who did exactly what, you know, in an office 60 years ago, and who said what and who came up with what aspect. That, in a weird way, is as hotly contested by some people as who really was giving the orders, if anybody, on November 22nd, 1960. So again, I don't want to trivialize the assassination or those
Mhm.
real deaths or those real, history shattering events, but it was in some way familiar territory because you know, I was, my joke is I didn't get enough grief writing a book about Stan Lee. I thought I'd try something, non-controversial like the Kennedy assassination.
Mhm.
But there is, weirdly enough, that similarity between those two topics.
Excuse me, I saw an interview with a biographer a number of years ago, and this person had done a lot of different presidential biographies, and they asked her, would you do a biography of like this president or that president? And she looked at the camera and she said, the thing is with these biographies is I spend years with these people and I get up in the morning and I have breakfast with them and quite frankly, I don't want to spend any time with this person who you've asked about. And so the question I have for you is, how did you feel about spending so much time with Jack Ruby?
You know, that's a very good question because she's right. I mean, that's, you know, you, I went into it naively. I
Uh-huh.
sort of had a certain, especially when I was doing the graphic novel, I had a certain point of view about this guy. I almost thought of him as maybe a slightly more sinister version of Ralph Cramden from The Honeymooners.
Uh-huh.
He almost seemed, like Jackie Gleason. Um, you know, if if the Gleason character, and you know, I've read different opinions about whether or not, you know, off screen Ralph Cramden would actually have slugged Alice, or whether he was all
Mhm.
bark and no bite. And it's an interesting academic or fanish conversation to have. But I sort of, because he was sort of a stocky guy who was built almost like Gleason, and was given to like saying a lot of kind of unintentionally funny things in interviews he gave. I kind of thought that maybe he was just maybe a slightly more sinister version of Ralph Cramden, and I think maybe for the graphic novel, I still held on to that, but the more and more I researched, I mean, the deeper I got into it, because once you're talking about the strip club and nightclub scene in Dallas in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, you're only like a degree or two separated from like the human trafficking
Mhm.
scene and of prostitution of Dallas in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And suddenly, you're, people who you thought of, say, if Ruby was Jackie Gleason, then sort of the other players were kind of like, gruff but lovable other characters in the sitcom. After a certain point, you go, oh, these are really creep.
Mhm.
These are really people operating. These are sinister people who, who may have rationalizations for what they do, and may, may in most aspects of their lives be upstanding citizens, but at the very least, they're looking the other way.
Mhm.
And so I was. It became a much more unpleasant slog than I had realized. I was very naive about it. Even it almost I had again I had sort of almost duped myself into thinking that even the gangsters and criminals were like the characters in Guys and Dolls. They were kind of
Mhm.
you know Damon Runyon-esque type of characters, but they were, these were so that so it was not. There's a certain unpleasantness. There is also a certain, um, you know, so yeah, I couldn't avoid that, and I just think, okay, this is it. I'm committed to this. I sort of, I am interested in this person and the world they lived in, you know. So what I did in the book, even more so than I had originally thought I would, was to try to delve, since my mission was not solving the mysteries of the Kennedy assassination, my mission then became exploring this guy, Jack Ruby, what made him, and then how his actions affected those closest to him.
Mhm.
Because, if Ruby, for the everybody I think has seen the classic photo, even if they don't know exactly what it is or why it's famous. Ruby was at the very least eccentric. Both he and Oswald were nuts. They had deep histories of psychological issues. Whether they were lone nuts is the question, of course. Um, but I tried to imagine, and what's it like to be. Ruby was one of 8 siblings, actually one of 9, but there was a daughter who died as an infant in a horrible scalding accident. His mother was institutionalized numerous times. His father was a violent alcoholic. Um, and Ruby, just very, very difficult. What's it like to be watching TV, to be watching Oswald being taken from one jurisdiction to another, and to see your crazy brother, Jack, step up and kill him on live TV? What does that do to your family?
Mhm.
What is that? How does and so that's so I spoke to Ruby's niece and nephew. I went through a lot of interviews with his siblings. I had the notes from his rabbi who came to visit him, as I said, every other day for 4 months in prison. So that was the angle. How does that affect your family? And and um, and it's an incredible story, about how the family kind of came together, but then they were these eternally squabbling, and yet intermeshed siblings. Some of whom lived in Dallas. But I mean, imagine that, say in the case of his nephew, one of his nephews, imagine your name is Ruby, you live in Dallas, you're 12 years old, and you've been telling all your friends that your uncle owns a strip club because you're 12 years old and your uncle owns a strip club.
Mhm.
And then and then one day he kills the guy accused of killing the president on TV, and then 2 days later you have to go back to school. So that was the perspective, and that was sort of and then Ruby himself. Oswald will never know what he would have said, or beyond "I was a patsy." I mean, which really, I mean, maybe it meant something, but maybe it was just the classic thing that every criminal says.
Mhm.
It was a patsy. Um, Will and there was no working tape recorder apparently in Dallas Police Headquarters. Well, so we only have other people's words for what went on behind closed doors with Oswald, and then the few things he said when he was, in between, when he was out there doing these sort of news conferences. Jack Ruby didn't shut up for 3 years.
Mhm.
He was an endless source of quotes and sound bites and opinions and rantings and ravings and observations, many of which contradicted what he'd said the day before, the hour before. So, I mean, that's, much of which contradicted his testimony before the Warren Commission. He did two testimonies, one strapped to a lie detector, one not. So I tried to sort of, kind of, if with the Stan Lee book and with my other books, I tried to sort of get into the minds, and look, even with my comic book work, trying to get into the mind of Peter Parker.
Mhm.
Um, I tried to bring that to it, and with Ruby, of course, tried to base it as much on um, actual existing evidence and interviews and recordings and other, and writings by smart people, um, and the rabbi's observations from when he visited Ruby in prison, and a guy named Hillel Silverman was the rabbi. He only died 6 months ago at age 99, and he gave me access to these very detailed notes he took visiting Ruby.
Did he give those notes to anyone else as well?
I've seen them quoted elsewhere, so I'd love
Okay.
to say I had exclusive access.
Uh-huh.
However, I've never seen anybody quote more than a line or two from them. I think because not only do I quote from them, but I intercut them with like the trial transcript and the news of what was going on and other people's, recollections of their visits to Ruby. So I have not seen anybody else make as much use of them, but I can't. The rabbi was he was a public figure. He played himself in a TV movie about the assassination,
Okay.
directed by Stan Lee's cousin Mel Stewart, who directed Willy Wonka and the Chocolate
Uh-huh.
Factory. So it all comes together. So
That's
so Silverman, my wisecrack about him used to be, you know, he was the rabbi in that synagogue in Dallas for 10 years, and then he was kind of burned out. And he was in his early 40s, I think, and kind of was ready for his next career step. And he transferred to a synagogue in LA, where he had a lot of movie and TV people. And I used to joke, yeah, he went on to become Buddy Hackett's rabbi, but it turns out he actually did become Buddy Hackett's rabbi. So he was not a guy who was, he liked, he had a very interesting career. I have two copies of his memoir, because in the age of Amazon, it's like I can't find that copy, but I can get another one for $1.98. So
Uh-huh.
so I may make up a lot of the demographic of whoever bought, but and in there he talks a little bit about Ruby, but the reason he had these notes, I think, Ruby's trial was probably the biggest circus trial until the Chicago 7 or Chicago 8 trial several years later. It was just an incredible circus, especially people, obviously he was guilty. Question of what was his state of mind? Was he legally insane? Was there extenuating circumstances? But he prevented there ever being a trial of Oswald. So this trial became a focus of media. And everybody in the room, from the judge to the jurors to the rabbi to half a dozen other people in that room, were taking notes to write books because they knew they were living and experiencing and participating in history.
Um, how much did after Ruby goes to jail and he lives for another 3 years? Was he in the cell with anyone else besides the rabbi coming to visit him?
There were a lot of people came to visit him. I mean, his family was
Right.
constantly there.
But did he have a cellmate?
No, he did not have a cellmate, but he had, it was, look, it's very interesting. And in a way, I think this is one of the things that maybe debunks conspiracy theories because Ruby, he was technically guarded. I'm sure you'd
Mhm.
have to be somewhat skilled and stealthy to get in, but he was not very well guarded. I mean, if somebody wanted to rub him out, it, I can't imagine it would have been that hard in those 3 years. Um, the, he didn't have a cellmate, and he was isolated from the other prison. He was sort of he could hear prisoners. He would hear, like, prisoners having nightmares or whatever at night, and he interpreted that as that he had started a second Holocaust and he was hearing the sounds of Jewish children being tortured and dismembered and boiled in oil.
Mhm.
Now, maybe he was making that stuff up and just trying to show he was crazy, but it was pretty consistent. So he spoke to a lot of people who came and visited him, family, people in the show business and criminal underworld of Dallas. And then there was one particular guard who seemed to be intent on either converting Ruby to Christianity and or getting him to admit that it was premeditated and that he wasn't suffering some horrible fugue state. So he
Mhm.
spoke a lot to this one particular guard. Um, there's a lot of, at the sixth floor museum in Dallas, they have thousands of interviews done with people, people even tangentially.
Mhm.
That was where I did a lot of my research. And again, there's interviews that are available, but that most people have not delved into much. And so you could see that there were, comedians. I don't know if literally strippers came to visit him, but I'm sure they did because, Ruby he had this hair trigger temper, and he would hire, if a lot of people couldn't stand him and didn't want to have anything to do with him, but there was sort of this odd de facto family he had of entertainers and dancers and staff people who would quit and come back, who he'd hire and fire literally several times a day. But I guess if you could deal with that kind of personality, but they really, I mean, that's partly where my misimpression of him as almost a sitcom star came in because a lot of the cast of characters would make for a great sitcom, except for
Mhm.
the guy was engaged in, like, human trafficking to a certain extent and killed Oswald. Um, so it was, and there are probably half a dozen people who in interviews or their own reminiscences refer to themselves as Jack Ruby's best friend.
Mhm.
So there was something about the guy that a lot, even after he did what he did, people wanted
Huh?
to claim that, and they didn't say I was one of his best friends. They all thought they were his only best friend, and really, I don't know. Who knows? I mean, I don't know if Jack, maybe the moment that they were in that room or in that cell talking to Jack, maybe, because the guy. I mean, it's right. One thing we can't forget about Jack Ruby. is that as sort of odd and crazy and irrational as he often appears on the record, there's a number of people who were at his Warren Commission testimony who describe him as taking over the room,
Mhm.
including from Earl Warren, right? So there was something in Ruby that could click, that could click into non-crazy mode or crazy in a way that just people, were intimidated by him. And again, let's not forget, whatever got him into that room, and there's 100 theories, but whatever it was, here's a guy who walked up and shot point blank a guy who should have been the most heavily guarded person in the world at that moment, So as much as it's kind of fun or interesting to make light of Ruby or to kind of point out his eccentricities or malapropisms, he was a violent, sinister guy in a lot of ways, even though he had a lovable side. So writing about somebody like that was really a challenge. And the deeper I got into it and realized, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into?
Mhm.
You know, so yeah, it was definitely challenging to try to portray a reasonably accurate, a reasonably accurate picture. But then part of my job, as I see it, as a writer, as a biographer, is to sort of give some manner of interpretation to who he was and what he did.
Um, as you were researching all of this, and you said at the beginning of the book that, if anyone asked you what you thought about the assassination, about the conspiracy theories, it would depend on what the last thing you read or saw was.
Yeah,
Um, it Did this fit into any preconceived notions you would have had about the assassination, or did it or did it change it? And the reason why I'm asking that is I have my own opinions. And I felt that your book like fit right into my preconceived notions of the whole thing. Um, and I'm curious if something like that happened with you, because we all have something going on in our subconscious, if nothing else, where it's like you've made a decision one way or the other, even if consciously you're not saying so. And I'm wondering if as you study through this, you're like, oh, somewhere in your head, I was completely wrong. Or I was right. I knew it. He was
yeah,
crazy. You know, is that a hard question?
yeah. But it's a fair question. I mean,
Okay.
it's the question you're going to get asked when you take on writing about anything. And you say, I mean, that sort of comes with the territories. I learned pretty early. There are a fair number of conspiracy theories that are not crazy.
Hmm?
That Rob Reiner right now is doing this podcast about the Kennedys. Rob Reiner and Soledad O'Brien are doing a podcast on iHeartRadio, and Reiner has a point of a definite opinion, and so the podcast is leading towards proving that opinion.
Hmm?
As I listen to it, I find it entertaining and interesting because he's Rob Reiner and she's Soledad O'Brien, and they're both solid professional storytellers, you know. Um, but it seems to me that Reiner is doing what a lot of people do: is he's sort of cherry picking data that will lead to the conclusion he's decided makes the most sense. The problem with the Kennedy assassination is not a lack of data. There is so much data, you know, that it becomes overwhelming. It becomes a tsunami of data.
Hmm.
And after so many years and so much, at least unintentional and probably intentional obfuscation on, by various people for whatever reason to make themselves look better or competent or smart or maybe for some, you know, bunch of theories that make sense, and the Warren Commission itself is full of holes and and implausibilities, but all and the Warren Commission, I mean, they presented a unified front, but a lot of, I don't think there was real agreement, and certainly among the younger members of the staff and the lawyers, I think, there was a lot of dissent and thinking that they put it out prematurely. So the question, every theory I've heard always has a phrase along the lines of, it's only logical that, one can only assume, it
Hmm.
only makes sense that, which, and so it's sort of, and those often involve leaps and of logic that have not convinced me. But of course, you get to the Warren report, and that's sort of, you know, largely the quote unquote single bullet theory.
Hmm.
Um, I'm not a ballistics expert. I don't know. I mean, right. So that doesn't seem to make sense, but I suppose, I mean, one thing that I did learn, I made a couple of different trips to Dallas over the years, one specifically as a research mission, but, standing in the book depository window that Oswald allegedly shot from, I've never fired a gun. Okay. So you can maybe discredit everything I'm saying in my book. I have never actually fired a gun. However, despite what photos taken from Dealey Plaza up to the window look like, from the window, it would seem to me that anybody even mildly competent could make that shot pretty easily. You
Hmm.
know, um, so so I mean, so look, so maybe that shot, could that bullet have taken that path? I don't know.
Hmm.
you know, I mean, it's fine. There were like in 1976, there was a congressional panel convened to deal with the ambiguities and the doubts about the Warren Commission, and they definitively proved, quote unquote, because of sonics tests, that there was definitely a second shooter somewhere. However, like a decade or so later, somebody disproved that. And then just yesterday, I read an article reproving it.
Uh-huh.
That's something that was done. So, I mean, like I said, it's too much for me. So I I guess I look. I guess when you read the book, I probably lean by default towards the Warren Commission because nothing else has convinced me. But it's certainly, I don't claim, you know, I'm pretty. I don't think I don't think Oliver Stone got it right in JFK.
Uh-huh.
I think the Garrison thing, but certainly Garrison was basing some of his stuff on some really odd stuff going on in New Orleans. A guy named Andre Codrescu has done a podcast focusing, and actually has written a play. Yemenia Codrescu from NPR as a commentator and as a poet. He's got a very distinctive voice. A lot of people might know. Um, he did a whole series of podcasts and this show, this play about the idea that, based on a book by a guy's name I'm forgetting, but about a guy named Kerry Thornley, who was a Marine who served with Oswald and wrote a novel about Oswald, like several years before
Hmm.
the
You
assassination.
mentioned that at the beginning of your book.
And so so there's a million. It's there's just a million different theories, many of them plausible. So that's why I said that thing in the introduction. People ask me, it's like whatever I read most recently. And look, it actually took a while to sell the book because some publishers, some editors told my agent point blank, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
They said, if you're not advocating a particular conspiracy theory, I can't sell the book. And even if it's the most well-written book of all time, if you're not advocating a particular theory, I can't sell it to my superiors, and because they think they can't sell it to the public.
Mhm.
So Chicago Review Press was willing to take a risk on this book that does not advocate a particular theory. Because believe me, there's a part of me that there's a part of me that almost wants to throw a dart at a board and pick a theory and stick with it, you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
Just so I could answer a question like that and point my finger at the camera and go, "Here's what really happened when I was
Oh,
when I was 10 years old, 1,500 miles away. I know what happened,
uh-huh.
but I don't, right?"
Well, I've avoided asking you what you think, and I'm not going to ask, because that's not what your book is about.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were a conspiracy theorist writing a book about a conspiracy theory, that would be something. But, you're just researching the guy who killed the guy or who they think killed the guy. Um, but
Exactly.
that being said, you do go into this stuff with ideas as well. And I'm curious, not to go into conspiracy theories, but um, I'm curious because in the introduction, I made that comment about, we don't have those now. And you actually mentioned one at the beginning of the book.
Right.
Um, and I'm curious because I think that a lot of people have perspectives on what is happening today. And I'm not going into specifics, but I'm curious if any of the perspectives that you have with stuff that's being thrown out there today has made you take a look at what happened when you were 10 and say, you know what? This is the same kind of thing. And maybe, I should listen or should not listen to these people throwing these theories out there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, look, your question is there a secret cabal of people controlling what we do?
Uh-huh.
That's your question.
Well, no, it's not actually.
Okay. Okay. Then
It's
what?
well, no, my question is, I mean, that's a whole different thing. I mean, that's not
Well, it
even
is and it's not. But tell me what your
it
tell
is
me
and it's
try
not.
to
No,
boil
my
your question down.
question is, um, as you take a look at modern events and you hear these theories that are floating out there today about other events, which may or may not sound crazy, does it make you take a look at some of those theories that happened 60 years ago and say, you know what? That thing that's happening now isn't the ideas behind it and what people are saying isn't that different from what they were saying 60 years ago. So maybe I'm going to look at this thing from 60 years ago differently because of what's happening now.
Or
Uh-huh.
would I look at what's happening now in light of what happened 60 years ago?
You could do that as well.
Look, I'm a professional storyteller. I spent my
Uh-huh.
entire working life telling stories.
Sure.
Humans have a great need for stories, for heroes and villains, and stories that wrap up neatly with conclusions. And if a story has a conspiracy or a group or a cabal or or a secret whatever behind it, all the better. Humans love, we need that.
Uh-huh.
We need to not believe, right? What's scarier? I mean, I say this in the book. What's scarier? That everything is random and meaningless, or that everything is planned and controlled? I don't know which is scarier. They're both terrifying,
Uh-huh.
you know,
Mhm. Mhm.
that we have no free will or so much free will that things are just bouncing around like molecules.
Mhm.
So I'd say in the book and in interviews like this,
Uh-huh.
I feel some responsibility to not be an alarmist, but not be overly naive. And so
Mhm.
that's the razor's edge I'm dancing on as
Uh-huh.
I answer your questions. Um, yeah, and it's a shifting razor's edge, and
Sure.
my feet are getting cut up.
You just don't look down.
It has
You
to.
just don't look down. It's the answer. So, Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up if you don't mind.
Okay.
There,
No, no,
there are
I
like
must talk about myself more. No, go on. I'm sorry.
no. There's a million other things, but I can see.
We can do a part two if
Okay.
interested.
Well, you know what?
Anyway,
I'll tell you what. If you do end up coming to Chicago, for anyone who doesn't know what that meant, when I was talking to Danny the other day, we talked about, him traveling around and talking about the book. And if you come to Chicago, we can do a part two. We can talk about the Chicago connections
right.
and how Jack Ruby had that really mysterious disappearance between, what was it, 1925 and 1933.
Well, none of it was mysterious. It's just he wasn't a public figure, so nobody cared where he was.
Well, no, we're dealing with conspiracy here. It's absolutely gotta be mysterious, especially since Al Capone went to jail in 1933. But we won't talk about that now. We'll do that for part two. Uh,
Okay, Scott, your job is to find a venue in Chicago where we can come and talk
yes, we can do that.
and be highly paid for it.
That's even better. Um, so tell us where we can find the book and how much fun you had writing it before we wrap this up.
It was a lot of fun writing it,
Uh,
because because all these characters are bigger than life, because you know they were not unlike people I'd come across in my life. Look, Jack Ruby grew up in the Maxwell Street Jewish ghetto of Chicago, sort of the equivalent to the Lower East Side of New York City, say. People who his best friend throughout his life was a boxer named Barney Ross, who from an era when boxing was a Jewish sport, in an era when boxers would pretend to be Jewish so they would be more popular. Ruby was an aspiring boxer. He was best friends with this Beryl Rosowski, who became Barney Ross, whose life story was stolen for a movie called Body and Soul that starred John Garfield. Ross sued the producers and won. That's how close that movie. It's a great movie with John Garfield, directed by Robert Rossen, by the way. So I recommend that movie to everybody. But um, so it was fun being immersed in these characters, especially if you could put out of your head that these gruff but lovable characters, especially Jack Ruby, killed a guy, change history um, by killing a guy on live TV. Um, so it was definitely fun to imagine myself in these, and then going to Dallas and seeing these places, eating at Campese's Egyptian restaurant, which is now sort of a theme park. It's like
it is.
it's a mob theme restaurant, up to and including a picture of Al Pacino as Michael Corleone on the
Uh-huh.
wall, inscribed to Joe Campese from one Godfather to another. So so all that, and meet a lot of interesting people, who I interviewed or who have an opinion or a factoid, or and of course the most surreal thing that happened. Can I go on a little with this
Oh
answer?
yeah, go right ahead.
There's an anecdote that Gabe Kaplan told, the comedian Gabe Kaplan of Welcome Back, Kotter. Gabe Kaplan told on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast about 4 or 5 years ago about auditioning for Ruby, right at the beginning of Kaplan's career. And it's a great story, and I recap it, and
Mhm.
luckily I
I remember.
luckily I credit both Kaplan and Gottfried in the book. And so I'm giving a talk to the Dallas Jewish Historical Society on November 20th, just a few weeks ago. And on the screen, I got a picture of Gabe Kaplan, because I'm telling the story from his Welcome Back Kotter days. And I'm looking in the audience, and this guy looks familiar, but everybody looks familiar. It's a bunch of old Jews coming to hear me talk about Jack Ruby. They all look like me or my relatives. So I figure, okay, this guy look. I think I've telegraphed the ending already, but I'm sitting signing books at the end, and this guy comes up, and I said, "Who do I make it out to?" And he said, "Just make it out to Gabe." And I go, "Holy shit, you're Gabe Kaplan, aren't you?" So that, you know, so that was like a surreal, so in some ways it's been, you know, look, like with, my joke is, when I did that talk about Stan Lee and Jack Ruby, my smart ass wisecrack about it was, somebody said, "What do they have in common?" I said they both had big years in 1963.
Mhm.
You know, um, which by the way, it's the year the Avengers and the X-Men debuted. Anyway, it's
Uh-huh.
the heart of the first Marvel, wave of the Marvel so-called revolution. Anyway, the book um, can be found on Amazon and independent bookstores. If your bookstore doesn't have it, demand they order it. But from all the usual sources. I've also, as I've done with the Stan Lee book, Disguised as Clark Kent, and Superman on the Couch, I've also done the audiobook
Mhm.
for Jack Ruby. So if you enjoyed this past hour, imagine 14 hours of this pumped into your headphones. But yeah, it is at all the usual outlets, and it's a digital book. I don't know. I need to find out if it's large print. One of my relatives asked me if it was large print, and I need to inquire about that because that's it's funny. That's an audience you forget about. I'm assuming at some point it will be translated into other languages, but I do not know for sure. I know the Stan Lee book was translated into half a dozen languages.
Uh-huh.
Maybe this one. Um, I've had a lot of good, Gabe Kaplan gave me a terrific blurb. I got a really complimentary, um, you know, um, notice about it online from Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. He's also a, um, a expert on MSNBC and other channels. So I mean, I've had people seem to get what I'm doing. I'm going to be doing an event soon, or I'm having a conversation with. I'm not sure if an event, but with Bert Griffin, who was the person who was on the Warren Commission. Excuse
Mhm.
me.
Mhm.
People assigned to investigate Ruby's background and story and possible motives. So I know I'm going to have a conversation with him, and I hope that will lead to an event. So it's like I said, people do seem to get what I'm doing. I'm sure there will be people who know, So my mission seems to have succeeded, and so I've been very pleased with the reception for the book. Um, but yeah, it's published by an actual publisher, and you can get it in the usual places you can get published books.
So, my last question, then I have a comment or two for you. So is your next book gonna be about Giuseppe Zarg oh shoot, I forgot his name and I had it. You know who I'm talking about, don't you? The
No.
Zingara.
Oh,
Giuseppe
Zangara.
Zingara. And you know who that is.
Yes.
And since you're doing conspiracy theories, I was gonna so I know a lot of Chicago history, and I certainly know about that conspiracy theory. And for anyone who doesn't know, Giuseppe Zangara had killed Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak in Florida during a speech that President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt was giving in 1932. And and it was funny because I had mentioned to Danny when we spoke earlier this week that they had done a new version of The Untouchables, and that was filmed here in Chicago. And it happened to be going during the 30th anniversary of the JFK assassination. And they had this two-part story which had the assassination of Mayor Anton Cermak, and they had like multiple shooters in there, and they did the whole Kennedy thing, and it aired like the week of the anniversary of
Right,
the Kennedy
right,
assassination.
right.
So it was kind of fun. But but some people think that Zangara had been a mob enforcer and that he was actually there not to shoot at FDR, which people had assumed at the time, but to actually kill Anton Cermak for various things that Cermak was doing in Chicago. So while you're doing conspiracy theories, I would think that that would be the next one on your list. So, especially if you want to come to Chicago.
Well, I hadn't thought of that as my next book. I've got a few different things that I'm considering for my next book.
Uh-huh.
Um, I don't think I've. although I got to say a lot of things I felt about the comic book business in my three books, my
Uh-huh.
really four books about the comics art form and business, I think I may still have more to say about comics and popular culture. However, you know, I would say that while I'm glad I did not choose to write a book about Lee Harvey Oswald because his story is really complicated and full of, boy, not just rabbit holes, but like dinosaur holes, I
Mhm.
mean, just so that would certainly, that's challenging. And there are aspects of of Oswald's story, So I'm wondering if maybe there's some, because of my age and, because of my age, I'm a child of the 60s, which is kind of partly overlaps into the 70s. But I am interested in various aspects of that culture. If anybody's interested, yes, I do have a proposal for a Bob Dylan book that I'd be glad to send you. Um, so certain, there are aspects of 60s culture that that have stuck with me, because of the generation that I'm from, and if because there aren't enough baby boomers writing about the 60s, but it's one of those things where, well, yep, lots of baby boomers write about the 60s, but lots of baby boomers buy books about the 60s also, and maybe even people from other generations. So I have a feeling that will, I don't think I'm going to be probably not going to be writing about Da Vinci, probably not going to be, you know, um, what I mean? But so, Zangari, you never know. I mean, that is a fascinating story.
Interesting.
Sort of a set, right? That would be like there's pretty much no doubt about who Jack Ruby was aiming for.
Uh-huh. Right.
um, but yeah, the thing. So and look, I would love to come to, you know, I, I, if time and money were no object, I would have come to Chicago and done more hands-on research there because I think there's a lot to be uncovered,
Mhm.
and so I only half jokingly said find a place for us to talk because I think it would be great to talk. I think sort of the way that I didn't realize till I was there that speaking at the Dallas Jewish Historical Society to a
Mhm.
room full of people who were in Dallas as children when the assassination happened, I didn't quite, I kind of knew that might be if I didn't quite realize how full the room would be of Jewish
Mhm.
people worried about how Jack Ruby would affect the reputation of Jewish people. It would be in the room when I spoke, and they because I my fear was that they would go, "You don't know anything, you New York carpetbagger. What are you an idiot?"
Yeah.
And and instead, what people did was they told me stories about like how their grandfather had worked with Jack Ruby or their uncle knew, you know what I mean? So I
Mhm.
have a feeling if I came to talk to Chicago, hopefully, um, people would still be reasonably polite. Although I get that Chicago is a little gruffer, perhaps. Um, but I mean, I'm sort of curious. I have a feeling there'd be an audience for the book in Chicago, and I'd be curious
Mhm.
to talk to people, in
Mhm.
Chicago to hear sort of their stories like that. And if I got something terribly wrong, to hear that too.
Sure. So,
So.
okay, I'm gonna let you go. Real
Okay.
quick. You know, I've
And and and,
done
and of course the book
some.
is published by a Chicago publisher, published
That's
by
right.
Chicago Review Press.
Um, so I've unintentionally over the years accumulated a lot of Danny Fingeroth material, and it just finds me. But I have to say
Me
that
too.
you can't avoid it. But and clearly I can't either. But the thing that I found about this book is I honestly think it's the finest work that you've done so far.
Well,
I think you certainly have more to go, more things that you're going to be doing. But And it's not to say that any of the stuff that you did in the past was lesser.
I understand.
I think that that you're writing on this, and actually, since I had the audio book, I got to listen to you read it. I thought that what you did with the audio was really great too. And so this is, in my opinion, you're the finest piece of work you've done so far. And that's not, again, it's not to say anything is lesser.
I'm taking it totally as a compliment. I'm not,
Okay. Oh yeah, I know. Yeah.
I'm not responding because I'm
Oh,
like
sure.
literally because I'm literally, well, I guess I'm not speechless, but I'm not responding because
Uh,
I can't really think of anything to say except thank you, you know.
It's no, I thought it was really great. And I'm not 100% finished with it yet. And part of the reason why, and I'll be honest, is I don't know how much time I want to spend with Jack Ruby. And there comes a point where it's like, yeah, do I want to listen to this or do I want to listen to Harry Potter? And it's like, well, Harry Potter is my friend. So, and I think that, you said it yourself about him. He's got kind of a sleazy quality about him. And, but I do think that the book is fantastic.
Well, thank you. I really,
And
that
I,
really, especially based on our early, the other conversations we've had.
Mhm.
You know your stuff. You are a smart guy who knows a lot of stuff, and I really and you're a Chicago guy, so
Mhm.
I really, I very much appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And so we're going to end it with that. And there will be something new coming up pretty soon. The last person I interviewed was your friend JM DeMatteis,
Oh,
and it was actually a number of months ago. So I'm hoping to do this a little bit more regularly. You're kind of the kickoff of
oh,
that.
good. Yeah. Well,
So,
JM is a great interview, and a great guy. So,
yeah.
you know,
And he's got
and
a Spider-Man book coming up.
right, right, and he speak. He's one of the people over the years I've interviewed and had
Uh-huh.
the interviews transcribed. He's one of the few people, maybe the only person I ever interviewed, and this includes a lot of smart, articulate, creative people. The only one who speaks in complete sentences.
Okay.
A rare thing. Even the most intelligent people will break off. They'll digress. They'll just sort of lose a train of the. JM, you know, is the only one who you look at the transcript and you go, this guy speaks, and not in a dull way, in a very interesting way,
Mhm. Mhm.
incomplete sentences. It's, you
Mhm.
know, so yeah, it's a great. So if following him would be fine with me.
Great. All right. So thanks so much
Thank
for
you, Scott.
oh, you're very welcome. Thank you everybody for tuning in. And again, if you'd like to read a free digital copy of the first issue of Visitations, you can click the link below, or you can email me at visitationscomicbook, all one word, at gmail.com. Take care, everybody. We'll see you later.